Thank you. We now come to the first Select Committee statement. Pete Wishart will speak on his subject for up to 10 minutes, during which no interventions may be taken. At the conclusion of his statement, I will call members to put questions on the subject of the statement and call Pete Wishart to respond to these in turn. I call the Chair of the Scottish Affairs Committee.
Eternally grateful to you, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I am to the Backbench Business Committee for giving us the time for the statement. And this is indeed the third report of the Scottish Affairs Committee and the result of a short inquiry we held on RBS branch closures in Scotland. Madam Deputy Speaker, on the 1st of December last year, RBS announced its intention to close 62 branches across Scotland, leading to the loss of 158 jobs. These closures would be in every part of Scotland and would result in the loss of the last branch in town for many communities, contrary to the commitment that was given by RBS in 2010. The reaction to the announcement was, as expected, overwhelmingly negative, with communities, business groups, unions and members of parliament from all parties in Scotland expressing their grave concern at the loss of such valued community assets. Rarely, Madam Deputy Speaker, I have to say, in my 17 years in this House that I mark today, have I seen such a unanimous response to a single issue. And when protests and demonstrations are organised in usually quiet and sedate communities such as Aberfeldy in my constituency, you know that something unpalatable has been offered to these communities. In our inquiry, we took evidence from representative groups and organisations, and we invited members of the public affected by these closures to get in touch. We held 2 evidence sessions involving senior executives from RBS, with RBS CEO Ross McEwen joining us in our second session. We took the opportunity to hear from the Lending Standards Boards, who oversee the voluntary code of practice on branch closures, and we are of course grateful to all who took the time to help us with this report. In our evidence, we were told that rural communities would be particularly impacted by these closures. Scottish Rural Action told us it can take people a long time having to use several modes of transport and at great expense to travel to the next nearest branch, sometimes involving ferries as well as public transport. We were told that those with mobility issues and caring responsibilities would also be particularly badly affected, and we received accounts from individuals concerned about the impact of their elderly relatives. The consumer group, which was very helpful to this inquiry, noted that bank closures disproportionately impact vulnerable customers, particularly those in rural areas, those without access to good broadband and those on lower incomes. We heard from business groups who told us it would be much more difficult to run a business in much of Scotland, including many deprived communities and those, like my constituents, which are dependent on tourism hotspots. The FSB, in their evidence, said closures often created additional costs for business owners, making it more difficult to manage cash flow, with productivity in the wider local community suffering as a consequence. We concluded, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the closure of these branches would be a devastating blow to the affected communities, removing vital services relied upon by businesses and disproportionately affected vulnerable customers. We were not convinced that RBS fully appreciated the damage that these closures will do to the community and businesses that rely on these branches. Madam Deputy Speaker, RBS told us in their evidence that these closures were driven by changes in customer behaviour. They said that they are closing branches in response to the increasing numbers of their customers accessing services online and via mobile devices. And where there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that customer behaviour is evolving, with more people now using digital services, what we found in our inquiry was a real demand for a local branch as a feature of local communities. We also explored whether RBS was in fact trying to lead customer behaviour by incentivising customers to transfer to digital accounts and force them onto other platforms by this programme of closures. RBS were keen to assure the committee that there were no targets set, with no incentives for digital take-up involved. However, we did see reports in the press, including a screenshot of a document appearing to show that documents and incentives were set, which we asked RBS to clarify. In their response, they told us that colleagues have goals to serve our customers, well, and Screenshot was a standard performance document in which staff are expected to agree objectives with their line managers, as well as ways of measuring against these goals. I will leave it up to this House to assess whether public behaviour in this is being met or whether public behaviour is being led by RBS. What we did find, almost quite curiously, was that these closures are not motivated by any savings to the bank. RBS will only save some £9.5 million, a significant sum, but absolutely nothing against their cost base of £4 billion. It's actually a smaller figure than what RBS spent on sponsoring rugby, which came in at £11 million per year. It begs the question, therefore, Madam Deputy Speaker, why are RBS antagonising their customer base with this unpopular closure programme for what to them is merely a pittance of a saving with all the subsequent reputational costs? It might have something to do with Unite the Union's view that is to improve the value of the bank's shares and to ripen it up to go back into the private sector. And of course, this week we find that RBS shares are to be marketed at significant cost to the taxpayer who acquired them at almost double the value when the banks were recapitalised in 2008. That then brings us on to the majority shareholder in this issue, and that, Madam Deputy Speaker, is you, me and the taxpayers of the United Kingdom, who still own over 70% of the stock of RBS. The government are the stewards of this public interest, but have showed no interest whatsoever in exercising any influence as our guarantor in this closure programme. The stock response from government is they do not get involved in commercial decisions. We were profoundly disappointed that no government minister gave us the courtesy to come to our committee and were prepared to be challenged by the committee on that assertion. And we could maybe explore further with government ministers what influence could have been exerted. And it remains baffling that as the main shareholder, the government has expressed no view whatsoever on these bank closures. We repeatedly asked RBS what would happen if the government sought to make its displeasure known and perhaps asked them to reconsider its closure programme. We never secured a satisfactory response to that question. What Ross McEwen did tell us was that he had received no representations from the UK government to the subject of branch closures. And we say in our report, if RBS does not act on our recommendation to halt these closures, we recommend that the government use any influence that it has as majority shareholder to put pressure on RBS to reconsider this closure programme. We did, though, actually make some headway in securing concessions from RBS. After our first evidence session, RBS announced a reprieve for 10 branches until the end of 2018. They also offered a variety of other concessions, such as giving the buildings that they own over to community use and assistance with digital services for high-use regular customers. The reprieve branches were primarily the last bank in town and more than 9 miles from the next nearest RBS branch. When this was announced, RBS said that should any of these branches see sustainable transactional increase and viable new income over this period, then we will reconsider the closure of the relevant branch as part of a fully independent review. RBS provided little information about how these reviews would be conducted, with the company originally charged to lead this work now unable to do so. And there remains a great deal of uncertainty about how these branches will therefore be evaluated and on what basis decisions on their future will be taken. We therefore have very serious concerns that these branches are simply being set up to fail. In our report, we say that RBS should postpone the review of these branches until 6 months after the independent reviewer has been appointed. Lastly, Madam Deputy Speaker, the whole process of consultation has been spectacularly woeful. There is currently no requirement under the Access to Banking Standard for banks to consult customers or staff ahead of a decision to close a branch. And given what we've seen in the public response to this report, there is great interest by local communities to be consulted ahead of branch closures. We therefore recommend that the Lending Standards Board consult on amending the Access to Banking Standard to require banks to consult its customers before final decisions on branch closures are taken to assess the impact of closure on these customers and communities. Branches this week, Madam Deputy Speaker, are now being closed and vital community assets are being lost. We say, even at this stage, let's see what we could do to keep these branches open. If RBS truly wants to meet the needs of its customer base, it should respond to this overwhelming evidence and halt its closure programme. Given the recent profits reported by RBS, this is a cost they could easily afford to bear.
Stephen Kerr.
Thank you, Madam Deputy